Hello, and welcome to the Book Tapestry. If a single book could destroy a civilization, would you burn it to save the world, or would you die to protect it? That's the question that's been keeping me up at night for the past week. If you've been following the blog or listening to this podcast for a while, you know I love pulling together polished, beautifully cited research essays. But lately, I felt this pull to change things up. I want to pull back the curtain and show you the actual, raw research process, the exact moment my comfortable assumptions get completely wrecked by a text. Because honestly, what constantly surprises me about reading deeply is how quickly a single simple question leads to 5 more. And for me, this entire spiral started when I recently sat down to reread Umberto Eco's masterwork, The Name of the Rose. Welcome back to the Book Tapestry, where we unweave the threads of great literature to see the history, philosophy, and hidden systems underneath. I'm Sophia Wordsmith. This is episode 22. When I first opened the book for this reread, I approached the medieval church with a very modern, very comfortable assumption. In my mind, I pictured a simple top-down hierarchy, corrupt, all-powerful authorities at the apex, perfectly obedient monks at the bottom, and a giant institutional machine driven purely by money, greed, and raw power. It's a standard historical narrative, right? But the deeper I went into the world behind the novel, the more unstable that assumption became. Suddenly, I remembered Plato's discussions on perception. He argued that our perception is a form of knowledge heavily shaped by what we already know or what we've personally experienced in the past. I realized my own view of medieval history and church systems was incredibly limited, so I decided to stop guessing and actually dig deeper. What I discovered instead was far more complicated, and honestly, 1,000,000 times more intellectually interesting. The medieval church in Eco's world wasn't a single, monolithic machine at all. It functioned much more like a civilization-wide operating system, a system built out of completely overlapping power structures, fiercely competing intellectual traditions, and fragile networks of authority. And the moment I saw that, the name of the rose stopped feeling like a simple murder mystery in a monastery. It started feeling like a brutal battlefield over a single question. Who gets the right to define what is true? One of the biggest breakthroughs for me during this research process was realizing that the monastery and the grand church hierarchy actually operate under 2 entirely different power structures, even though they exist within the same regional authority. There are 2 separate systems running simultaneously, and they are constantly grinding against each other. First, you have the macro structure, the institutional church. This is the large-scale global hierarchy we all know from the history books: the Pope, the cardinals, the archbishops, and the bishops. This massive apparatus governs doctrine, dictates international policy, and wields political influence across all of Latin Christendom. In this era, the Pope isn't just a religious leader, he is the ultimate anchor for diplomacy, political legitimacy, and international social order. But then, you step inside the abbey walls, and you hit the microstructure, the monastic order. Inside this local space, a completely different hierarchy is in play: the abbot, the prior, the librarian, the monks, and the novices. Now, on paper, the abbey belongs to the global church, but in reality, it desperately protects its own internal sovereignty, and that creates immediate, intense friction. Think about it. A bishop might demand absolute compliance over doctrine at the macro level, but an abbot can stand at the monastery gates and insist that the abbey governs itself. And it gets even pettier and more fascinating than that. A librarian, someone who officially sits lower on the organizational chart, might quietly possess vastly more practical power than the abbot or the bishop combined, simply because he controls the access to data. When I was mapping this out in my research notes, it instantly reminded me of the modern American political framework. It's exactly like the ongoing friction between federal and state jurisdictions, where overlapping layers of governance are constantly fighting over who has the final say. Uncovering these layered hierarchies completely changed how I read the book. I realized that if you want to solve the mystery, you have to look past the official titles and figure out who wields genuine, practical influence. When I first read the book, I mistakenly assumed that Jorge, the blind old librarian, was effectively the highest authority because his terrifying presence completely overwhelmed the abbey. But now I see what Eco was doing. He intentionally blurs the line between official power and practical power, and that distinction matters enormously. This brought me to another massive misconception I had. I used to view the medieval church purely as a religious institution, but the deeper I dug into the history, the more I realized it was a multifunctional entity. It was a religious authority, yes, but it was also an educational system, a legal structure, a political powerhouse, a social safety net, and a global intellectual network all bound together. And what was the source code for this entire system? Latin. Latin functioned as a civilization-wide operating language, which I find incredibly brilliant. I have a working hypothesis that Charlemagne was the primary architect behind this linguistic unity, though that's a deep historical thread I'm planning to research much further in a later project. But here is the catch with a unified system. Whenever friction builds up between regional desires and central institutional authority, the system starts to fragment. And when it breaks across the board. Languages separate into local vernaculars. Religious traditions divide. Political systems shatter. Fast forward a few centuries from the novel's setting, and you see this exact breakdown happen with the rise of reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. You even see it later in the secular world when a philosopher like Immanuel Kant decides to write his masterworks in German rather than Latin, signaling the final, permanent fracturing of that unified intellectual world. Once I started viewing the medieval church through this systemic lens, the era's absolute terror of heresy suddenly made complete sense. To the medieval mind, questioning a minor point of church doctrine wasn't just having a different opinion or exercising free speech. It was an existential threat to the stability of civilization. It was a virus introduced into the operating system. Voices are great, right up until competing voices begin to totally destabilize the country. This brings us to the characters moving through the abbey. Something I completely underestimated during my first reading was just how meticulously Eco chose the specific religious orders for this story. They aren't just colorful background details to make the monastery feel authentic. Each order represents a completely different philosophy on how humanity should interact with truth, knowledge, and authority. First, we have the Benedictines. The abbey itself belongs to this tradition. Their core spiritual pillars are stability, prayer, preservation, and deep scholarship. This is why the library and the scriptorium feel so ancient, disciplined, and heavily structured, because Benedictine identity is literally baked into the physical architecture of the stone walls. They are the ultimate preservers of data. Then, stepping right into their home turf, we have the Franciscans, represented by our detective, William of Baskerville. This was a massive eye-opener for me during my research. I used to hear Franciscan and just picture humble, gentle monks who loved animals, but by the 14th century, the Franciscans were locked in a fierce, dangerous political battle with the Pope over apostolic poverty and the limits of church authority. William represents the cutting-edge intellectual wing of the Franciscan order. He is intensely disciplined, deeply analytical, and aggressively skeptical of anyone who claims premature certainty. The moment my research led me to the real-life historical philosopher William of Ockham, Brother William's character completely clicked for me. Eco even explicitly mentions Ockham as Brother William's close friend in the novel, and I strongly suspect the name William itself is a deliberate historical nod, though that part is my own fun speculation. Finally, we have the Dominicans. In the novel, they are the terrifying voice of enforcement. Eco associates them heavily with rigid doctrinal precision, aggressive interrogation, and absolute inquisitorial authority. Now, Eco isn't just making a lazy, black-and-white argument that Dominicans are evil, but historically, the Papal Inquisition was largely staffed by the Dominican order. They were a terrifying force in the medieval world. Honestly, as a fantasy fan, reading about them instantly reminded me of the brutal Steel Inquisitors from Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, just pure, unyielding systemic enforcement. So, when you look at the murders in the Abbey, they aren't just random acts of violence. Eco has layered a real, historical collision right into the fiction. The plot is a physical manifestation of a war between preservation, the Benedictines, inquiry, the Franciscans, and enforcement, the Dominicans. The bodies are dropping inside that exact intellectual collision. What makes this collision so gripping is how shockingly modern Brother William feels as he navigates it. He doesn't look for signs from heaven. He investigates entirely through meticulous observation, logical inference, the elimination of variables, and calculating probability. Eco beautifully blends medieval scholasticism with early scientific empiricism, wrapping it up in the familiar coat of detective fiction. I mean, the name Baskerville is a dead giveaway. It's a brilliant, playful nod to Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles. But beneath that literary Easter egg lies a much darker, much more serious reality. The intellectual world of medieval Europe is visibly buckling under the weight of competing interpretations and institutional panic. William stands right on the edge of a historical knife. He belongs entirely to the medieval world, yet he thinks with the mind of an early modern scientist. That internal tension is exactly why he feels so incredibly alive on the page. This realization marked the absolute biggest shift in my own thinking during this project. I realized that these oppressive medieval structures weren't built solely out of malicious greed or simple financial corruption. They were desperate, frantic attempts to prevent a complete and total social collapse. Now, let me be incredibly clear. That does not excuse the horrific things done in the name of authority, but it complicates the historical picture in a profound way. There is one line from the novel that completely stopped me in my tracks, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. William says to his novice, "The simple cannot choose their personal heresy, Adso, they cling to the man preaching in their land." That line completely rewired how I understood medieval fear. Imagine a world plagued by constant famine, brutal localized warfare, total instability, and near-universal illiteracy. In a fragile environment like that, if multiple radical, competing voices suddenly emerge, chaotic movements can spread like wildfire, tearing apart entire communities overnight. In that kind of world, controlling the interpretation of data wasn't an exercise in intellectual vanity. It was directly tied to basic civilizational survival. I stopped seeing the medieval church as a precursor to our modern local churches, and I started seeing it as a fragile information network, desperately trying to maintain coherence across a collapsing society. The deeper I go into The Name of the Rose, the more I realize that Umberto Eco didn't just write a book. He constructed a massive, intricate labyrinth of interconnected systems. And because I am thoroughly lost in this labyrinth, I already know exactly what my next research path is going to be. I'm setting aside some of my lingering historical questions about the religious orders for just a moment, so I can jump straight into the physical reality of medieval books. In the next episode, we are going to look at the material science of the 14th century. We'll explore how parchment, vellum, and linen production actually worked, why a single book was extraordinarily expensive to produce, and how that extreme economic scarcity created absolute intellectual and political power. Because the more I read Eco, the more I suspect that the great library at the heart of the abbey isn't just a fascinating setting. It might actually be the true political center of the entire novel. Thank you so much for joining me on this research journey today on the Book Tapestry. If you want to see the detailed visual breakdown of these macro and micro power structures, make sure to head over to the blog at thebooktapestry.com, where I've posted a conceptual network map outlining everything we talked about today. Until next time, keep following your curiosity, keep pulling at the threads, and happy reading. Thank you for listening to the Book Tapestry. If you found this helpful, please share it with a friend who prefers listening over reading. See you next time.